Welcome to this program of the Stanford Historical Society, Voices from the Hennessy Presidency, Reflections on University Leadership. This program is inspired by 21 oral history interviews focusing on the 16 years of the Hennessy presidency from 2000 to 2016. Eric Knight, a scholar of organizational theory and strategic management, and executive dean of the School of Business at Macquarie University in Australia, thought that something extraordinary happened at Stanford in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, and that it ought to be studied. Eric conducted 19 of the 21 interviews. The other 2 were done by members of the Stanford Oral History Program. All the interviews are now published in a new book, Voices from the Hennessy Presidency. Here it is, and it's available today. Our program today will be a conversation with John Hennessy and John Etchemendy, moderated by Eric Knight and Patricia Gumport. Eric Knight, the prime mover of this focused oral history program, flew in from Australia to participate in today's program. Joining Eric as co-moderator is Patricia Gumport, Professor of Education and Director of the Stanford Institute for Higher Education Research. She also served as Stanford's first Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Postdoctoral Affairs from 2006 to 2019. As a sociologist of higher education, she has focused her research and teaching on key changes in the academic landscape and organizational character of American higher education. John Hennessy, an engineer and computer scientist, has a long history at Stanford. As a teacher, as a researcher, as a dean, as a provost, John is also a recipient of the Turing Award. He continues to be involved in the Stanford Knight-Hennessy Scholars Program, which he co-founded in 2016. John is a voracious reader, and he plays golf enthusiastically with a certainty that things will be better next time. John Etchemendy, a philosopher and logician, was provost during the entire Hennessy presidency. At Stanford, the president and the provost are a powerful team. Both share the leadership burdens of the university. The provost is chief budget officer and the chief academic officer of the university. Today, John Etchemendy is the Denning co-director, along with Professor Fei-Fei Li, of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, HAI. Eric and Patty, the floor is yours.
Larry, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Fantastic. Well, can I start by thanking the Stanford Historical Society for hosting us today, and also the Knight-Hennessy Scholar Program and Denning House for having us here today. We have about 150 of us in the room, about 500 joining online, not only from the US but around the world. So it's wonderful to have this conversation together. My name is Eric Knight. I'm a professor in the study of organisations at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and I wear 2 hats today. One is as the editor of the book that's now released on Voices of the Hennessy Presidency, and the second is as a co-moderator for the discussion today with Patty Gumport, who I've got to know over this project, and I'm delighted to be doing this with. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the motivation for this project from a wider external lens, and then Patty will continue on from that. And I think the context to appreciate this project within, as maybe reflected by my Australian accent, is that there are a wonderful set of universities around the world, hundreds, that attract incredible researchers, passionate teachers, and people within those institutions who are called to serve in various ways, as a head of department, as a research centre director, as a dean, as a vice provost. And for those who have that privilege, one of the ingredients that one comes to appreciate is important in those roles is something that probably all of us share in common today, and that is an interest in history. The history of one's own institution, to understand its origin story and where it's coming from, but also the history of other institutions so that they can offer some inspiration and some aspiration for the future. And so today is about looking at Stanford's history as a lens into the wider question of leadership challenges in higher education. And I know there are many in this room that have a very deep knowledge of Stanford history, from Jane Stanford, Fred Terman, Wally Sterling. But today we're going to focus on a 20-year period, or a 16-year period, 2000 to 2016, under the leadership of John and John, which I think is noteworthy for at least 4 reasons. One, the longevity of leadership during that period. 16 years is a long time and enough time to be able to achieve some wonderful things. The stability of that leadership. Many of the people in that leadership team stayed for that entire tenure and are here today. The dynamism of that period. I realised that I got my first email address around the year 2000. So this was a period when digital technology came of age. And so that posed interesting and challenging questions for computer science, for engineering, for health, medicine and beyond. And also, of course, the incredible productivity of that period, which we'll come to appreciate more fully today. So I might just pause there to give a little bit of the motivation and also to open that up for those who are joining us, in particular online, from institutions beyond Stanford, to appreciate this history as a lens into the wider question of university leadership. And Patty, you might build on that in terms of the Stanford context.
Yes, thank you, Eric. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So it is an honor to join you in facilitating today. We are very excited to have this unique opportunity to talk with John and John about your extraordinary leadership and the vision that you had for bold innovation and lasting institutional change. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we're happy that you're joining us. I wanted to say one other thing about my vantage point, which is so internal and complementary to Eric's. I first came here over 40 years ago. First as a graduate student, then faculty. And as vice provost, I was able to have this very close working relationship with John and John, with members of the leadership team and throughout the university. And this is really a special place, and I hope you all get a feel for that today. We will be very informal. We'll be using our first names. And since you have the same first name, what this means is John Hennessy, we will refer to you as John, and John Etchemendy, we will refer to you as Etch. Is that okay?
I want to be John, he could be Hen.
Just kidding. That's great. Clearly, Eric and I are not calling the shots. So, okay. Our format will be in 2 parts. So the first part is that Eric and I will take turns posing questions to John and Etch. And then we'll open to questions from the audience here in person as well as online. And we'll wrap up by 6 o'clock for a reception for the people who are here. So Eric, would you like to begin with the first question?
Great. So John and Etch, maybe you could start with a little bit of a scene setter of Stanford University in the late 90s. Where was it up to? What was happening, both in the institution, perhaps maybe within the Valley more broadly, just for those who weren't there or perhaps don't have that context in mind?
Well, I think it was an interesting time. We had, under Gerhard Casper's leadership, made some significant investments in the quality of the undergraduate experience, which had become a focus really in the 90s with this notion and a famous report by the Carnegie Institution on the quality of undergraduate education in the leading research universities. So we had done that, and when we needed to do some fundraising to support those changes, but the things were established quickly. Many of the things that Gerhard did, freshman and sophomore seminars that Gerhard and Condi led, took off right like that, and the faculty and students found something they both viewed as a major enhancement in the quality of education. So from the very beginning, John and I started thinking about where do we want to go next with the university, given that we've made this investment in undergraduate education. How can we ensure that the university is making a real difference in the world?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate, what Gerhard did was really turn around the institution. When I came as an assistant professor, this was like many, many large research universities where the first focus was on the graduate students. And oh yeah, there were these undergraduates, yeah, and you had to teach them as well, you know. But he completely turned it around, and it was actually very easy because he got faculty teaching freshmen, Nobel Prize winners, teaching freshmen in small seminars, and they loved it. I'm teaching a freshman seminar right now, actually, and I loved it. I love it. So it really did change the focus of the university, made it a more balanced place, and certainly a much better place for the undergraduates.
You know, the other thing I'd say, Eric, is we viewed the country, the world, as facing a number of large problems, right? Certainly the beginnings of climate change were already upon us. The challenges we faced in medicine, the challenges we faced. Lots of us in my generation thought when the Berlin Wall fell, global peace was going to break out forever. And instead we discovered that, in fact, we still had major issues in terms of peace and security and quality of life around the world. So we started thinking about, brainstorming, what should be the role of the university in thinking about these big societal issues?
He's jumping over some stuff, okay?
Yeah, when we started thinking about it.
When we started, I think it's very important that when we started, we didn't know exactly what to do. We didn't have a clear vision. And one of the really important things at a university is you have to get the vision from the bottom up. And so we built a vision and took that from there. But we didn't have it when we walked in the first day.
So I want to build on that question of vision in a little bit. Can you say something about how you found each other in the leadership team? So John, how you were called to the presidency and how you came to encounter John and start working with him as your provost. I know it's in the book, but maybe you could share it to the group.
So John was the co-chair of the Presidential Search Committee, the faculty co-chair. One of the disadvantages of being on the Presidential Search Committee is that you sign a piece of paper that says, I will do whatever the president asks in the future. We had known each other. We had worked together on a university task force that Gerhard had run on the role of technology in education. So we knew each other casually. I knew how well respected John was. And I wanted somebody who I could work with. He's a logician. I'm a computer scientist. That works well. But somebody who represented also a different part of the university. After all, I was the first engineer to lead Stanford, and a lot of people were a little nervous about having an engineer leading the university. And John's background as a humanist really, and a philosopher, complemented that.
So let's build on that a little bit more and talk about your approaches to leadership. Can you let us be a fly on the wall and think back to your early conversations about how you talked about leading? What did you have in mind?
Well, I think the first thing we had to do was build our team, the team of deans, vice provosts, vice presidents, and we wanted to build a team in particular that saw themselves as university leaders, first and foremost. And yes, they're responsible for a part of the university. Bob Joss was responsible for the business school. But he saw himself as a university leader, contributed in decisions about the whole university, about undergraduate education. And this is really unheard of. So I think that was the first job number one, was to build that team. And that's something I think I'm very proud of the team that we built.
Yes, and so you had criteria in mind when you were selecting people, I imagine, for these roles. And, you know, I do think you encouraged us to do that kind of bridge building as opposed to silo building, and that was so important. What you may not have planned is that we really did enjoy working together. We liked each other. How did you foster that?
Well, I think we thought of the deans, vice provost, and the provost and president as sort of the academic planning group, the group who would really conceptualize where we wanted to go as a university. And by really fusing them as a think tank, being open to new ideas, new perspectives, that helped us create and develop working relationships. But you're right. I mean, the deans and the vice provosts liked each other. They liked working together, and that made it much easier to kind of all pull in one direction. I still remember one of the great events when we were launching one of the campaigns. Bob Joss got up and talked about the importance of the arts at Stanford. To have the leader of the business school do that was transformative, absolutely transformative.
So Patty, let me say something about this leadership group, and which met, every week. We met together. We discussed issues about the whole university, and this is the deans and vice provosts. I chaired the accreditation team for a large East Coast university, Ivy League university, and I won't mention which one. And I actually said to the president, do you meet with all of your deans together? And he said, why would I do that? And that's how we coalesced into a group.
So maybe to build on that, you've given a sense of the leadership team. You also mentioned, Etch, that the vision came from the bottom up. Can you put a little bit of detail around that vision? What emerged? What were the big ideas? Where was the direction heading from those conversations?
Well, it started the first year we had a massive kind of planning up. We called it a needs assessment. So we had all of the schools thinking about what they needed, what to be excellent. We had groups that thought about the university as a whole, broadly speaking, about the undergraduates and graduate students. And that process resulted in, as you would expect, a very big number, right? And so we then had to work with this, with the deans, with what we call executive cabinet, to whittle that down and figure out what really are the priorities, and where do we want to go. So we did that, and it took us a couple of years. We had 2001 happened right about that time.
The interesting thing when we were talking about this, we ended up, the initial roll-up was $12 billion, and the entire general use permit, which was supposed to last at least 10 years, would be used in the next 5. So it was way over, and we were thinking about maybe we could have a campaign that was $4 billion. So we were 3 times, and one of the person who was the chair of the board of trustees at the time said, well, this just shows that their wants are more important than their needs.
By the way, just to kind of scale this, $12 billion was equal to the total endowment at that time.
Yeah.
Endowment's grown since then. But, yeah.
So we really needed to work that down and really understand what the priorities were. We had some great people working on that, both the deans, but also some people who were important facilitators in thinking about how to organize and focus those things and turn those agenda items into things that were not only compelling for the faculty, but people outside would say, wow, that's something I really think Stanford should be investing in.
And so where did you land? What were the kind of overarching concepts? Could you share that with the...
Well, I think the environmental area was probably a first, right? The provost committee on the environment, and there were a whole bunch of faculty working on that, and you had to fuse it into something, though. Even that needed focus, right? It was environment, but what are you going to do in the environment? It's a giant space. And what are the key objectives that we're going to do differently? And out of that came the notion that universities in their research could become a source of important research breakthroughs and insights that society could use to address some of the global problems it was facing.
One of the things, early on in the planning, we were talking about, here's what the school would like or needs. And this was in a trustee meeting. And so we were trying to kind of get this into a coherent story, a coherent picture. And Walter Hewlett raised his hand and said, you have to stop asking what Stanford needs. You have to ask what the world needs. And I think that turned our thinking around in a quite significant way.
Yeah. And then eventually we tried to fuse this as we sculpted it out. I mean, one of the things I like to do is write a short position paper. If I can boil something down into 5 pages or so, then I've got a vision that's coherent. And I decided to try and do that for a group of trustees that were our working group for planning, to see whether or not I could write a 5-page paper that they would find compelling.
And so when did that crystallize? When did the paper begin to formulate? I suppose that formed the basis for the fundraising campaign and Stanford Challenge, but what was the sort of timing on that, and when did that begin to come together?
Well, probably around 2004, 2005, and then we were trying to finish up the undergraduate campaign before we announced another campaign focused on other things. But we managed to do that. In fact, we managed to have some overlap in the two because things were going well enough that we felt we were ready.
So, John, in the book, you talk about how you used to put issues into 2 piles, opportunities and challenges. And so we wanted to talk for a few minutes about challenges. So I think an obvious one we could begin with is the global financial crisis. How did you see it? What did you do?
Yeah, it was a challenge. Luckily, the chief budget officer of the university, the provost, and I were on the same page. We saw this as a problem. We saw the fact that the Valley was also incurring a slowdown. Randy Livingston, who was the CFO, understood the depth of the problem, as did the people at the management company. So John and I decided, first of all, we needed to really send a message to everybody about how serious it was, which is when we announced that we would reduce our salaries, and we asked all the senior staff to take a 5% salary cut as well. And then I actually felt we needed to move through the process as quickly as possible. Lots of other universities decided, well, endowments were to cushion you against slow times, and rather than kind of restructure things, they would kind of let the air out of the balloon slowly. The problem was $5 billion had vanished, gone. So it wasn't a small number. It was, and the size, we had gone from roughly 30% of the university's revenue being paid from endowment down to 25%, basically like that.
So to give you a kind of a scale of this, the endowment dropped 26% in 1 year. The largest drop in the endowment in the history of the endowment prior to that was 7%. So, that's a big, big hit on a very important income source. Yeah. And what many universities did, as John says, you have the endowment has a smoothing rule, so you could go through and take 5% cuts for 5 or 7 years and ease the university down that way. We decided to do it in really 2 years. We took the cuts in 2 years, and the reason we did was that you make much more sensible decisions when you think about, I have to cut 15% or something. What pieces of this organization can I get rid of? What activities do I no longer have to do? If you make a series of 5% cuts over a number of years, what you do is, well, let's save on the coffee. We'll make people buy coffee, and let's save on the copy paper. And
let's not replace those faculty. Let's not do this.
Okay. So that's one problem. You don't make good decisions. The second problem is, we both knew what would happen is that 4 years down the road, we'd still be making 5% cuts, and the economy would be great, and the faculty would be saying, "What in the hell? Why are we making these cuts? Everything's going well." Well, you remember back in 2008. That's why. Yeah. So anyway, we pulled the Band-Aid off, I guess is the...
Yeah, we pulled the Band-Aid off. We had, that year when we saw what was happening, we froze salaries, we froze hiring. We had 1 more year of frozen hiring and no raises. And after that, we were out hiring faculty while other people were still cutting budgets, which was a great time to be hiring. So it got us through. I had been through a layoff in my startup. I knew the best way to get through that process was to do it quickly. Do it once, do it quickly, get it over with, move forward, get to the light at the end of the tunnel.
We really benefited from John's having had experience out in the valley in companies. And so I think that he really deserves the credit for that.
Yeah, that's for sure, and we all appreciated it. So I wanted to turn to a different set of challenges, and here, Etch, I want to lead with you. So you had observed that universities are under attack from the outside as well as from within. And you identified, in particular, a threat from within that you said posed an existential danger to our mission. What did you see?
The increasing homogenization of viewpoints in the university. And this is true both politically, but it's also true, I think, in a lot of disciplines, that we tend to find the accepted narrative, and what is the party line on this particular issue in this particular field, and everybody that you hire is thinking the same thing. That is the anathema to what a university is supposed to be and what a university is supposed to be like. And so I was worried that we were getting more and more narrow and more one-sided. And that was really at the end of, that was actually when I was stepping down. I wrote a speech about this.
So you talked about how we need to reaffirm free expression.
Right.
And one question I think many are curious about is, how does that fit with our commitment to inclusion?
So I have a very clear answer to this. I mean, in my head, free expression and open debate are absolutely essential to what the university is and how it functions. So that has to take priority. And of course, we want to be an inclusive community. Of course we do. But we can't not have open debate simply because we think we're going to hurt people's feelings. And I think there we've gone a bit too far in trying to not just to include people, but try to make sure their feelings aren't hurt and so forth. And I think that's a disaster. That is.
Yeah. So just on that point a little bit more. So I think there is a question here about what is the university's responsibility, especially to our students? Is it to protect them in some way?
Well, one of the things, so I think one word that is not used frequently enough is resilience. We need to teach students resilience. And, students, it used to be that students were dumped off here by their parents, and this was the first time, and then they were kind of on their own. And they had already in high school kind of learned how the world works and been fairly independent. Now the students are coming much more protected, incredibly protected and nurtured, and never doing any activity that is not a planned activity and so forth. They get here, and at the other end, 4 years from now, we're going to have to send them off into the world. And between A and B, we have to somehow or other prepare them for that. And one of the important skills is resilience. Being able to accept things, yes, this hurts my feelings, or yes, I see that you you disagree with me, but I can deal with that. The old sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But that, people don't say that anymore.
You have this lovely line in that piece about how we don't need to protect our students, we need to equip them. That is our responsibility.
So I want to build on this. I mean, you've given a good sense of the values, principles, some of the macro context. I want to go back into the micro now and explore a little further some of the perennial topics, that befall leaders of universities. One of the things that you mentioned in the book, John, is that your planning cycle was 20 years into the future, which is pretty long. And I just wondered if you could give a little bit of insight around how do you go through a process that allows you to make decisions from that? How do you make hard choices? And how do you reaffirm commitment when you've got such a long planning cycle?
Well, so the reason I think 20 years is an appropriate planning cycle in a university is it takes a decade to put up something new, get it up to speed, get it really running with the quality and the impact that you'd really like. And if you're going to run something for 10 years, by the time you get it up to full speed, it's time to close it. And we all know that closing things at universities is the hardest thing you ever want to think about doing. We can start new things, but ending anything is extremely difficult. So we thought about that, and when we thought about what did we want to do that was new and exciting, that it would be something that we wanted to be in, not just for 20, but probably for 50 years in the future. As an investment. And then it was up to the leadership team to ensure that if we got something started, we were going to be able to provide the resources. Sometimes we try something as an experiment. We'll fund this interesting thing that a few faculty want to gather together. We'll fund it from our presidential or provost funds for a few years. If it really gets traction and looks like it's going to take off, then we can look for more permanent funding. Or we can just say, well, that was an interesting idea. It was worth 3 years of investment, but it really didn't take off in the way we had anticipated. So this is something I believe in firmly. Universities have to be willing to do experiments. They have to be willing to try new things in teaching and in research, and then say, well, some of them worked, they're transformative. Right? We've got the Woods Institute. We have the new sustainability school, the roots of which were built in this big investment we made initially in the environment. And some of them didn't work out the way we want, and we'll fold it.
So as a way of pulling out a piece of that when you did an experiment, it had a time limit on it, and it had an expectation of financial sustainability, perhaps. That was one of the things you were experimenting.
So one of the things you look for is obviously financial sustainability, but the key thing often is finding the faculty leadership. So often there's something that seems like a good idea, everybody thinks it's a good idea, a bunch of faculty are happy to sit and talk about it for a while, but none of them is willing to make it his or her life. This is what I'm going to work on for the next 10 years and devote myself to. And I'm going to have to give up some things in order to do that. And that is key. So if you secure the leadership, I'm looking out in the audience and I see some of our great leaders. If you secure the leadership, then we can help find the funds, the finances.
So expansion then is a key path forward then. You talked about how eliminating things is so hard for us. But as we expand then, of course, increases in size can change the nature of our organization. So how did you think about this, including in terms of enrollment even?
Well, certainly, there are limits on how much the university can expand, both in terms of physical land, what we could build, financial limits. We also thought about what about the undergraduate population, because as was pointed out, the graduate population seemed to grow and the postdoc population grew by leaps and bounds, as Patty will well remember. So we began to think about if we don't, because the graduate population is highly distributed. It's not controlled centrally, it's highly distributed, so is the postdoc population. So it would just grow because our faculty are really incredible researchers that can get new research funding and can increase the number of graduate students they have. So we began to think about how to expand the undergraduate population. And really, the argument that we made to the trustees that I think finally won is, if we don't do this now, we may choke off the possibility to do it in the future because we will have used all our available space for graduate students? And do we want to be, what ratio do we want? We had already shifted. We had already shifted to probably 45, 55 or so. And we were on the way. We would have been 60% graduate students if we didn't do something about the undergraduate population at some point.
Let me say something about other kinds of growth, because there's also, so John mentioned that the faculty grow and then they bring in additional graduate students and so forth. And why does the faculty grow? I think it's very important to understand that what happens at a university is new knowledge, new fields develop. And if you're a great university like Stanford, you then say, well, we need to have a bioengineering department, or we need to have a this, that. And so you add faculty in the field to cover that field. Now guess what? You don't at the same time balance it out by saying, well, classics, that's been around for a long time, let's close down the classics department, right? So there are some things. Sometimes there are fields that you stop doing, but usually a university does not say, well, let's close this department. We no longer need classics. We no longer need philosophy. We no longer, whatever. So that means that the faculty grow. Now, one of the things that happens, so we then end up, we look at this large and unbelievably stellar faculty that we have, that we've kind of collected at the university. And then we ask ourselves, we need to find a way to share it with more undergraduates in this case. So that was one of the reasons we really felt we had an obligation to admit more students. And it's all a drop in the bucket.
It is, because we can't make a really big difference in the US admissions rate, but we felt a few more students at Stanford would be a good thing, and we could take a role like that. I think John's right about this transformation. I mean, think about when I joined Stanford, our computer science department had about 15 people, had no undergraduate major. It was a graduate-only department. Now it's the largest undergraduate major in the university, and there are 60 faculty and lots of lecturers to teach the largest undergraduate major. So, and thank goodness we did that, because the field has just expanded in importance and the difference.
And by the way, before John came, there wasn't a computer science department, not many years before. Right, so this is a good example where here was a new field. We started a new department. We hired our future president.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and we created bioengineering, which was the first department at Stanford to sit between two schools, engineering and the medical school. And engineering and the medical school operate very differently. People, oh, there's this problem and this problem and this problem. The reality was we managed to start a new department which in 10 years was in the top 5 or 10 in the country. Mm-hmm. So that was an enormous achievement, which I have to say the deans really worked hard to make work and get all those small, petty, bureaucratic things out of the way so we could really hire great people and have great students.
So growth also enabled you to accelerate this vision we had for interdisciplinarity, right? You had many levers there for both reducing barriers as well as for advancing the vision. Could you talk with us about some of the levers that you had to work with?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, I see Carla Schatz in the audience, and Carla knows that we do interdisciplinarity better than anywhere else. And why is that? Well, we have some assets that are very rare. One is the entire university, for the most part, is on one campus. And it's on a campus where you can walk from you can walk from the business school to the medical school to the law school in 10 minutes apiece. Right? And so that's amazing. Then you can walk there because it's sunny, it's not raining, it's not cold. Right? All of those really kind of what may seem like trivial things are big things when it comes to being able to build a culture of collaboration across departments, across schools. And so we took that we took that and we tried to build on top of that. Now, it wasn't at the beginning. There were some schools, as I won't name names, but some of our schools really wanted nothing to do with the university except to have the name. Right? And we had to overcome that. We had to convince them, no, you're going to be better if you are a part of the university and integrated into the university. And we succeeded. I mean, we succeeded in
For sure.
The whole should be greater than the sum of the parts.
Yes.
That was kind of the message we were trying to send. And we had people like Carl leading things, Ann Arvin as vice provost of research. And we had one other thing. Every school at Stanford, every department at Stanford shares a focus and a dedication to excellence. And that meant we would make a better university. Everybody would work together in one direction, and that really helped.
Yes, and people were so excited about this vision. I think, I hope our audience, both in person and online, just remembers this or understands it. We had faculty, students, staff, leaders, we had alumni, donors, trustees. How did you think about communicating this vision more broadly to just build on this enormous excitement?
It started, we certainly used the faculty senate and other venues to talk about it. The fact that the deans had all come together on one page of the vice provost mean that we had a set of communicators that could go around the university. And then when we began the Stanford Challenge, we did an outreach event that Linda Meyer helped organize. And I told her, what we want is we want our alumni to be so excited about the difference that Stanford's going to make in the world, that they really see that difference. And that's what we captured. And we took people out and they talked about what we were going to do and how we were going to make a difference in environmental issues, in global peace, in these core issues, in medical transformations. And that really helped.
So much excitement.
Maybe I can build on that, because I think the tagline, if I remember, of the Stanford Challenge was something like seeking solutions, educating leaders. And so this difference out in the world, and you also talked about when you were thinking about enrollments, social obligation, is clearly an important part of your philosophy. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit to your conception of the role of Stanford beyond Stanford, noting as well that I know you both had prominent positions in the national field in higher education. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that wider plane.
Well, I think Stanford is a national resource. It's a global resource, but first and foremost, it's a national resource, and we have to understand that. And a resource in the sense of doing a great deal of the research that drives the country and drives innovation, providing education for undergraduates, graduate students, and postdocs, teaching leaders in the medical field. So we are a service organization. I mean, it's kind of hard to know how to. That is what a university is or ought to be, and it ought to see itself that way, as serving the country.
And I think we believed in that model. We also believed that Stanford had a long history of a transformative effect in Silicon Valley. Could we take that culture of making a difference in the world and broaden it to a wider set of fields, thinking creatively about finding new solutions? And the university in the end is also educating people. And you don't transform, you don't take these solutions and get them to the outside world just by writing papers. Papers are important, publications are important, scientific knowledge is important, but you also need carriers for that knowledge to really bring it out there. And universities have this remarkable property that every year a large number of people get up and leave. And they take all that knowledge and insight and bring it out into the world and help do wonderful things with it. And that's one of the great things about universities.
Well, this is great. So before we open to questions, Eric and I wanted to return to the topic of leadership. We know it's of great interest to the current and aspiring leaders that we've got in our audience. And our entree into this is to talk about your leadership attributes. So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit between the two of you. So John, in the book, you have said that Etch is the most patient person you've ever met. So why did you say that, and what created the need for patience?
Because I'm not the most patient person. As my spouse of many years will tell you, I tend to have a shorter attention span. I like to get things done. I don't like things getting too slow. And John was great. Etch was great. He would be willing to have the nth meeting, even though we've met with faculty or staff, we've explained it, so many meetings, we had several town halls, people would say, well, I didn't get to come to one, and he'd be willing to have another town hall to take the time to communicate again, while I would say, let's get on with it, guys. So we, in that sense, we complemented one another.
Well, and building on that, Etch, I think you know that you're very highly regarded for your, say, tough-minded and nuanced reasoning. So where did that come from? Is that your training in philosophy? Something else?
This is what I do. I'm a logician, right? So let me expand a little bit. I really do believe in trying to listening broadly before you make a decision, and listening broadly before you say what your initial opinion is. You know, one thing, when you're a provost or a president and you have a meeting, say, if you start out the meeting by saying, this is what I think we should do, now, what's your opinion? And guess what? Oh, yeah, that's what you should do. So you should never let people know really where you're coming from, and try to find out what they know, what they feel about. And then, you know, after you've gotten a lot of input, then you eventually make a decision. And I also believe that you have to be, I'm a fallibleist. I believe that you have to be willing always to reconsider. Mm-hmm. And if some new development, some new information comes in that you didn't have before, you have to be willing to say, oh, that decision wasn't a great decision. We're going to redo that. We're going to rethink it. So
I think we worked hard on developing a consultative model where not everything is a consensus. If everything is a consensus, it's going to be paralysis. So, but make sure voices were heard, people's opinions were considered, and that people understood when we didn't necessarily end up in where they thought we should end up. They understood the rationale and that it was reasonable.
And that
I think that helped us keep the support of our colleagues.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you were the instantiation time and again that diversity of thought is not just an asset, but it's essential to our excellence, and we all appreciated that. Eric?
Should we go to questions?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Oh, there is one last thing.
Mm-hmm.
The Stanford Leadership Academy, before we open to questions.
Yeah.
I think our colleagues at other institutions would be especially interested in this. So 15 years ago, you had the idea for this program for rising leaders in the institution. We've had about 250 participants. I was in the initial cohort, and I'm fortunate to be able to co-direct it with Bob Joss now. Could you talk with us just a little about this and whether you advise leaders in other settings to have something similar?
Yeah, the origins of this were that I had seen from my corporate boards, actually, the amount of effort that went into succession planning and preparing people to rise into higher positions in leadership. And I said, we weren't doing anything in the university to prepare people. So why didn't we have a process whereby we would prepare them to think about leadership, give them personal coaching, help them develop their skills, help them deal with, one of the hardest things in the academy is learning how to deal with a difficult decision and have a difficult conversation with somebody. And all of us avoid those conversations until we learn how important they are and how to do them well. So that was a key goal. It's now, as you said, Patty, it's been going many years, and we've had multiple generations of leadership for it, and it's been really great. And I think it's made a big difference in terms of the quality of leadership across the university.
You know, universities are bizarre places because so the faculty, we're primarily a faculty-led organization. The faculty are not trained in leadership. They don't enter higher education because they want to go up the corporate ranks. They want to do their research. They enjoy teaching, and so we hire all these people, and then we expect that some of them to sort of become leaders, to become department chairs, deans, and so forth. And we had never been consciously trying to prepare people for that. People that we saw had an interest, had a talent, and John had understood that this was important, and so he started this.
Oh, it's been terrific. So let's open to questions. Eric and I will be taking questions from in person as well as online. And so I'll begin with the in person, and we have a hand over there. So what we need is for you to get the mic and stand. And we will ask you to be concise. We have many questions that we want to entertain, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jeff Fenton. I earned master's degrees in economics in 1981 and management science and engineering, then called operations research, in 1982. Recently, it has been reported, even in national news media beyond the campus, that students are concerned that Stanford is not fun anymore. Is there any, and the perception that I had when President Hennessy was in office is that Stanford was fun. So I observed as a community member living less than half a mile from the campus and coming to all the football and basketball games, and remembering the reunion weekend in 2016 when there was a celebration for the end of President Hennessy's tenure, and hundreds of students joined the celebration and cheered him on. Can you say anything about the current atmosphere on campus and any steps the current administration could take to turn this around?
We won't include this.
Look at me.
I heard about this problem, so I arranged to refill Lake Log.
That's beautiful.
This event also counts as fun, so I think as an independent observer.
Right. Eric, would you like to take a question?
Yeah, look, one of the questions that came in online were actually about development, and so I'm just going to read both of them. They're from different people, but they're sort of in a related theme. In the book, several interviewees comment on the strength of Stanford's development organization. Do you have stories about working with Stanford development that might exemplify the strength of that, but also what might this mean, or what advice might you have for university leaders who don't have perhaps the generous alumni body or the financial resources that Stanford does?
So two things. First of all, the development organization is world-class professionals that has a focus on let's raise resources for the most important priorities of the leadership of the university. And that's what they're really focused on, really supporting the faculty and students in their work. I think there's a long history of building that up. I mean, my predecessor, Gerhard Casper, rejuvenated some of the efforts around reunions and making reunions really strong. And some of the investments that were made with respect to engaging students before they became alumni to make them realize that their time here was a gift from a previous generation who had supported the university and provided financial aid, provided faculty support that helped them, and that we hoped they would do the same thing for future generations. So building that up, and it takes a while to really reach fruition, but I think 15 or 20 or 30 years of investment then enabled it to really be transformative.
And is that distinctive to Stanford? Is it distinctive to the United States?
Well, certainly in the United States, there's a tradition of it. And I think one of the things we've discovered is alumni and supporters will support things they really believe are going to be transformative. Transformative for the world, transformative for our students. One of the, I think, great things we did, the thing that received the most positive correspondence from alumni ever was when we made the big change to financial aid. And we said, if your family makes less than less than $60,000 a year, your tuition bill will be zero. And our alumni cheered that on because it really sent a message about keeping Stanford open to the very best students, irrespective of their family background.
So John, I think we had a question on that side. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks, Patty.
Hi, Emily.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks to all the organizers for this wonderful event and this wonderful book about this extraordinary chapter. So I'm Emily Levine. I'm a historian in the Graduate School of Education. And together with some of my colleagues there, the sociologist Mitchell Stevens and also the university archivist Josh Snyder, who's sitting next to me, we'll be debuting 2 new undergraduate courses in the spring called Stanford and Its Worlds, 1885 to the Present, as well as a new ongoing Stanford Archive Lab to look at the historic role and responsibility of Stanford in the development of 5 worlds over time. So the West, the nation, the global academy, the students, and the valley, right, the Silicon Valley. So this is the last chapter of not of the university, hopefully, but of our class, of course. And so we hope that you will come back in the spring to speak to our students about it. But my question is actually is related. It's about institutional memory. So this chapter is usually associated with the future, probably more than any of them, right? Forward thinking, change, innovation. So I'm wondering to what extent then, during the moment, or now on reflection, you've thought about sort of how this chapter fits into what has been called the institutional saga of a university or of Stanford's universities. Because universities are so unique, as you mentioned, they're perpetual institutions. They change over time with the times, but of course they also retain a kind of institutional saga. That's what makes them unique. So how do you decide what's core and what's peripheral, what you can change and what stays the same? Thanks.
Well, what stays the same is a dedication to the fundamental mission of the university. And when things got tough, so for example, 2008 financial crisis, as we thought about what we wanted to do, we decided there were 2 things that were off the table. We were not going to eliminate faculty positions, and we were not going to reduce financial aid to students. And we decided those were the 2 things that were really core. That did mean, by the way, that most of the brunt of the cuts we had to make were taken by staff members at the university, which, thank God, they did it. Many people stepped up and took early retirement or looked for another job. But that was a kind of core thing of going back to core mission. What really matters about the university? The faculty and students are at the core of the university, and that's what we had to protect.
Yeah. Maybe building on that student theme. So we have a question here specifically on graduate students and postdocs. You touched on this a little bit, John Etch, but maybe you could unpack it a little further. So the question is this. One of the things that changed during your administration was an increase in the number of graduate students and postdocs at Stanford. What special challenges did you face as a result, and how did you deal with them?
Stanford, the special challenge Stanford faces is housing for every part of its population, and it's a killer. It's when we recruit a faculty member, they're comparing a housing at in New Haven or housing wherever, and but similarly we have to house more people of our populace than any other university in the country. So all of our undergraduates, now all of our graduate students have to be housed in either on-campus or subsidized housing. Postdocs, faculty, you name it. Staff, we've purchased some apartment complexes, and a lot of staff are in these buildings. That's the big challenge, and it's a big challenge for any part of the university, anybody at the university. Now, you mentioned specifically the graduate students, the number of graduate students growing and the number of postdocs growing. Notice those 2 populations, they're not centrally controlled by anyone. Right? Those are populations that grow because of individual faculty decisions, individual department decisions, and then the 2 of us have to find places for them to live, right? So you struggle with that. I mean, that is the biggest problem that Stanford has.
Do you want to build on that, Patty? I know this was something that close to your heart. Yeah.
Well, I lived this for
well.
13 years in consultation with many people here, all problem solving. And it wasn't just affordability challenges. We were also working on, with that growth, ensuring the quality of the training and education, and then ensuring the preparation for careers as opportunities were changing. So there's a lot going on here. Kept us busy.
And Patty was the first vice provost for graduate education, and she did a spectacular job worrying about exactly these issues and making sure that our graduate students were attended to and treated right.
Thank you, John. Worrying for sure, but also figuring out the solutions with the whole
Finding
community.
solutions.
So
Yeah.
it was collaborative.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the back right there.
I just have a question. I know you've talked a lot about how important a university is for the world, and everything's been talking about sort of grand visions, which I know are super, super important. But those are all long-ranging, 10 years, 20 years, like you were mentioning. What did you do as leaders? This is to sort of draw upon the other gentleman's question. What did you do as leaders during your time here to focus on the undergraduates' experience? Because they're only here for a short 4-year time, and they're not thinking, oh, I'm a piece of some grand 20-year vision. What's important to them and what makes them turn into a good alum and to keep perpetuating this whole university experience is to give them a really good quality of life and experience while they're here. So what was going on in those discussions in boardrooms where you were talking more about the micro of what that experience was going to be for a student? Because I think right now is so different than when I have 2 kids here right now, and I know that the experience from talking to several people and hearing all the stuff that's going on out, in public about this war on fun is that there's a real disconnect between the leadership and the student body. And I don't feel like that was there when I was here or when you were leading. And so what were some of the things that you did to make sure that you connected with the students and tried to make their experience the best that it could be?
Well, so at the micro level, we spent time going to visit the students in their dorms. So I tried to go to every single freshman dorm to just sit down and get them to realize that the president was a person, was a faculty member that really cared about them and their experience. And mostly I'd introduce myself and then just answer questions. The best question, well, they asked me about my favorite kind of music. Of course, it was music that happened before they were born. And they asked me, the best question I ever got was boxers or briefs. So that was kind of get in touch with them, understand what they were thinking about. But we also thought about some academic things. John talked about freshman seminars and things that Gerhard had started. But we said, look, this is a great research university. Every student, undergraduate, should have the opportunity to be in a research lab, to participate in a research project. And we thought of that as a capstone experience that would complement a freshman seminar or sophomore college as a way to really build a complete 4-year experience for our students.
Yeah, let me say something about the war on fun. So this is not about anything that we had to deal with. Our students were having fun all on their own, and we didn't want to know about it. No, just kidding. But one of the things unfortunate things that has happened is there's a demand for protection. Students and the society feels that they need to be protected. So, if something bad happens to a student, the university gets sued and so forth and so on. So you can't have a totally protected student experience and have fun, right? So there's this tension, and you have to work out the balance. What's the right balance? For example, you'll see out on Lake Log all these signs that say, "Do not go near the water." Do not dare. And of course, the students ignore that.
Yeah.
That's good.
It also says, "Do not drink the water," which I think if we accepted students who went and drank that water.
It's an admissions issue.
Exactly.
Well, on a more serious note, I do think, learning is fun. Like I remember our conversations about intentionally scaffolding relationships across generations. So undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, faculty in different areas and so forth, people out in the community, different kinds of community engagement really taking off. And it was really a special time, and a lot of that is still in place. So lots of potential here, folks. We're optimistic.
And John and I have taught in freshman seminars many years.
Yeah.
Boy, you want to talk to students that really enjoy learning and engagement, and they have some fun too. So I think there are ways to make learning fun, because the students are more engaged then.
So can we get a mic up here? Oh, over there and then up here. If you could run a mic up here. Where's the question, Sophia? Okay.
Hi everyone, my name's Emily. I am a current co-president of the Graduate Student Council, and I've really loved listening to everyone talk about sort of broad listening and trying to unify students, faculty, and staff behind this university mission. And something I'm curious about is, I imagine as leaders, you had to make hard decisions that students and faculty and staff sometimes didn't agree with. And so how did you sort of rebuild trust, rebuild collegiality, and rebuild collaboration, especially after decisions that might have been hard? And I guess going into it even, how did you sort of ensure that that collaboration was at the forefront?
John has already said something about that. I believe that the best thing you can do is, first of all, listen and make sure people know they've been heard. And then when the decision is made and the decision goes against what this group wants, you then have to explain. You explain your reasoning. You explain over and over again. You explain the rationale for doing what we end up doing. And then people go away and they can still think they don't agree, but at least they know it was not taken lightly.
I also, one of the things I did was I felt I needed to stay in touch with the faculty. Not just through of course I counted on the deans and department chairs to become avenues for faculty concerns. But I started a process of meeting with groups of about 15 faculty over lunch, which I started in the first year I was president. I actually started the year I was provost. And then I continued it. And I would go through the entire university faculty, take about 5 years. It's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You get down to one end, it's time to go the other way again. So I did that all 15 years, and it was a really good way to stay in touch, particularly in a university. The faculty are the core of what goes on, and staying in touch with them was absolutely crucial.
It certainly builds trust.
It builds trust.
Yeah.
It sends a message. We are colleagues together. We're working together for the best of the university.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Tina Seelig, and I'm fortunate enough to work here at Denning House, and I can promise you this question was not planted. So John, you, after this 16-year incredibly successful administration, both decided to go on and start new organizations, right? HAI and Knight-Hennessy Scholars. It would be really interesting to know what happened during your time as president and provost that inspired you to go and to launch these brand new initiatives.
You started.
Okay, I'll go. So I initially was contemplating, just kind of going into semi-retirement, maybe going on a few more boards, both nonprofit and for-profit, and maybe just do that, do a little teaching on the side. And one of our alums, Bill Meehan, who just recently passed, a GSB alum, said to me, "You're going to be bored doing a bunch of little things. You still have a lot of energy. Go find one big thing to do. So I started thinking about what could I do? And I said, well, what about building a program that really tries to prepare the next generation of leaders, bringing in the very best graduate students we could find around the world, build a community, and help them develop their leadership skills. And I spent a lot of time talking to the deans about it. The deans were very enthusiastic about doing it. So I went to the trustees and said, well, what do you think about this idea at a trustee retreat? And they were really enthusiastic about it. So then I went to Phil Knight and said, Phil, I need $400 million. And a month later, he said, okay. So that's how we got started. And we had a lot of, because people were so enthusiastic about what they're doing. And today, if you meet some of our scholars that are here, you'll see why this is a really good investment of resources.
And
John,
Tina,
HAI.
yeah, I didn't, HAI was not my idea. It was actually planned primarily by Fei-Fei Li and two of her colleagues, James Landay and Chris Manning. And they realized that AI was just going to revolutionize the world, and had its good side and had its bad sides, and had to be, people had to think about how to create human-centered AI. And so they had planned, and I started sort of advising them every once in a while, and then they twisted my arm to co-direct it with Fei-Fei, and James is our vice director, and so I did it. That was how I got into that.
So a question from online. John, you spoke a little bit about the importance of experiments, and actually you spoke about sometimes owning up to bad decisions. So the question coming in here is, thinking back, what would you have done differently in retrospect? Can you identify something you might have changed?
We've done differently. So John alluded to one thing. There were a couple of things we started, at least in experimental form, without really strong faculty leadership. And even though I could find people who were willing to financially support it, I couldn't actually close the deal until I had somebody who could stand up and talk to a potential donor and explain why this was a great vision. So we had a few things like that we got started that I think didn't really pan out, and I tried to force fit them, and that turned out not to work. So I tried that a couple times, and then I learned my lesson.
So, we made mistakes, a lot of mistakes. But I guess so more globally, I think I would have paid more attention to changing how we do new student orientation. So new student orientation is this week when we have the new freshmen coming in, and they're open, their minds are open, they're so excited, they actually listen.
They get up early, which they don't do subsequently.
They don't always get a lot of sleep, but they're bleary-eyed. And I think that we do not make the best use of that period. I think that we could sort of teach them, first of all, how lucky they are. This is one thing. We turn down so many people in admissions, and most, all the people that we turn down and end up going to, wonderful universities at Berkeley or wherever, they were just as deserving. They were just as deserving, and you don't want the students to think that, oh, well, I got here because I'm better than these people that were turned down. No, it was the luck of the draw. In many cases, they have to understand that. They have to understand what it is to live in a community, what it is to live in an intellectual community where you have dialogue. Anyway, I could go on and on. I would sort of rethink that part of what we do.
Yes, there's a question right here.
Hi, Jim Sweeney. One of the things that I saw grew very significantly during your time here, it didn't start during your time, but really grew, was interdisciplinary problem-solving research through institute, through departments, through undergraduate programs and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges, the pushbacks that you got, the success, and some lessons for the future for people who believe that interdisciplinary problem-solving activities at Stanford are really very, very important? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, Jim. I think, in many ways, the BioX was the cutting avenue for this, because it was our first real experiment of building something that was truly interdisciplinary from its initiation and creation. And when we built the Clark Center, we had, from the beginning, we had faculty from 10, 15, maybe even 20 different departments in there, focused together on a whole range of problems, from very basic science to more applied things, but focused on really trying to improve human health. It also acted under Carla's leadership and the directors before her as an incubator for new things that were emerging. And the bioengineering department, which went on to greatness, came out of that kind of incubator. Same thing about some of the ideas in neuroscience. So we kind of thought about how to do that, and even when we put the Wood Center together, there was a lot of focus on this because people knew that there were environmental concerns, but they wanted to hear about how is the university going to help find solutions to those environmental concerns, not just document them. And that really helped us get enthusiastic donors behind that activity. And you see it today. Look at the Sustainability School. The Sustainability School is about finding solutions for our future so that our children and grandchildren will have a planet where they can thrive.
John, did you want to respond as well? Or? I know you thought a lot about reducing barriers. That was a significant part of our conversations.
Yeah. One of the things I talk, reducing barriers between schools, reducing barriers. I often think of Stanford as a place that has no barriers or few barriers. Now, what I mean by that is we don't tell students, for example, that undergraduates are not allowed to take graduate classes. If they're prepared, they can do it. We don't tell people from one school that they can't. Students from one school that they can't take classes in another school, and this is all the way through the university. I think we have fewer barriers. Obviously, there are barriers, but fewer barriers than any other place that I know of. And I think that's very important.
Yeah. So this is probably the best university to have a joint appointment between two different departments in the United States. We have made it work. Many other universities are afraid to do this. It's too hard. It requires too much coordination. It's double jeopardy, all these problems. You can solve all those problems, and then departments can get together and say, well, we can hire somebody who's a star who make both departments stronger. And I think that's a real benefit to the university.
Thank you. So Eric and I were curious about favorite memories or best part of the job. Question to each one of you.
Favorite memories? Conducting the Stanford Band, I suppose. Or having the Cal Band come up to Hoover House at 2 o'clock in the morning just before big game, to serenade the president. We had a lot of remarkable memories. Winning Nobel Prizes and going to do that, seeing students thrive, going to graduation, hearing Steve Jobs give the best commencement speech ever. And just that kind of emotion and insight that he shared You know, it's great. I loved every minute of it, from the opening convocation, being there with the students in the quad when we do convocation, and getting to meet them and their families, to graduation. It was a marvelous experience.
Thank you, John. And Etch?
Well, Patty, as I've told you, I still think the provost job at Stanford is the best job in higher education. Way better than the president's job. You know,
But you know, my wife thinks the dean's job was the best job I had, so it's...
And I have to, I'll just sort of ditto what John said. I mean, it's such an amazing institution. It's so big. There's so many things going on. So from the Rose Bowl to the Nobel Prize winners to you know, the new hospital, whatever. It's just an amazing, amazing place. And to sit in positions that our positions and watch this happen, it's rewarding. It's really rewarding. I remember, so one of the things that the provost does is involved in capital planning, right? And so that's where you decide what buildings to build and and where to put them and so forth. And I remember the first time I drove around campus, and one of the buildings that I had decided to build and where it would go was there. It existed. And I suddenly felt like I was playing this great game of Sim City, you know, except it was not Sim, it was real.
You know, one of the other things I'd mention is we have the most spectacular, supportive alumni in the entire world. And one of the great joys of President was just going out and visiting alumni. And I did it across the country, around the world, and it was really terrific. And I think what people think about, what I did was go out and talk about all the great things that were happening at the university. And it was a really wonderful experience for me, and I think for them as well.
And I have to say, I have to add one other thing. Working with John.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we had a good partnership. We had a good partnership, and there is no way, when I was talking to President Obama, he said, how could you possibly do this job for 16 years? He goes, I've done it for 8 and I'm beat. And I said, I had a much better partner than you had, I think.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you.
Well, I was talking about Congress, of course.
Yes, of course. Yes. Well, you assured us that this would be fun, that this would be a celebration, and it has been. And so it's time for me and Eric to bring our program to a close. We would like to thank both of you. This has been such an engaging conversation. We've enjoyed every minute of it. And, you know, we're not going to go through the thunderous applause that we did for several years as you were completing your term of service, but we want to remind you both how much we appreciate your exceptional leadership over so many years and the ways in which you took your bold vision and made it a reality with lasting institutional impact. And I think another thing is also clear to all of us, which is your legacy is embodied in people. It lives on in us. It lives on in those of us who got to work closely with you. We knew on a daily basis that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we loved it. And your legacy also lives on in the academic generations who have benefited from all the changes that you were able to bring about. And lastly, I'd say it lives on in the people in the United States and around the world who have been benefiting from Stanford's contributions. So for all of that, we're so grateful, and I'd like to invite everybody to join me in applause.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you. Thank you. And I'd just like to say a special thank you to Patty and especially to Eric. This was Eric's vision. He made it happen. He worked incredibly hard on it. And I think it's a real testimony to his leadership and his inspiration. And hopefully it'll go on to help people.
That's it.
Well, John, thank you for taking the risk, the experiment, and for all of the interviewees who contributed to the project. I want to to thank the Fulbright Commission, because that supports US relations internationally, and that allowed me to be here. Knight-Hennessy Scholar Program for hosting us today, and Denning House, and especially Carol Vitucci for her expertise. The Stanford Stanford Historical Society for supporting this program. The Oral History Committee, what a fantastic committee. The Publications Committee, it's just such an asset and a gem to this university to have a committee like that at this institution. Natalie Marin Street, the Oral History Program Manager. Can I thank her incredible work that she had working with me to pull this together. Thank you, Natalie. Holly Brady of Holly Brady Publishing for her consulting help. Linda Cicero, Sonny Scott, Pamela Morland, and Charlotte Glaser and Larry Horton, and all those who've been involved in this event. I think Larry's going to close us out. The book is available. There are more voices, 21, if you've enjoyed this conversation, that you can continue the dialogue there. But Larry, for you to close.
Well, I think everyone wants to go to the reception, so I'm going to have 3 quick announcements. First of all, I was so glad to see Professor Levine stand up, because she's going to be the next program. But she's going to give a lecture and a talk on the academic freedom and the Ross case. This is real Stanford history. It was someone was fired at Stanford in 1900, and it had enormous ramifications. So that'll be our program in March. We're going to have a program in May with on George Schultz at Stanford, with Phil Taubman, who has just published a recent biography of Schultz. It's well received, and John Taylor from the economics department. And then next fall, we're going to have a program on the years of Wallace Stirling, which is 1949 to 1968, and that's going to coincide with the publication by the Stanford Historical Society of the first full biography of Wallace Stirling, written by a PhD from Stanford who was Stanford archivist for a number of years. The second point I want to make is that, the really important is that just today or yesterday, we posted in the Stanford Library, so it'll be there. It's part of the collections, and it'll be there forever and accessible in the libraries. Full oral histories of John Hennessy by David Kennedy, and John Etchemendy by Richard Saller, who is a great historian himself. So those things are really great treasures, and they're available for anybody, and you can even download them and so forth. And finally, I just want to point out that I would like to encourage you to become members of the Historical Society. All these programs exist because we have people concerned to preserve and publicize Stanford history, and it's supported by their gifts and dues. So please join us. That way you'll get email notification in advance of all the programs. You'll be able to attend them online. We now have more people online. There are people right now in China, really, that are watching this program. So thank you very much. It's been a great program. Let's have a nice reception. Thank you.